All right, it is time for the Public Square. Glad to have you with us this week. We're going to talk about Dave Zanotti's excellent adventure, and more importantly, our good friend, Dr. William B. Allen, is the focus of our program today, Dave.
Wayne, it's amazing that I get to be in the studio at the American Mission Center today. I'm just reflecting.
Yeah, there you are, right in front of that beautiful fireplace and studio. It's wonderful. I have a camera view of you right now, so.
Yes. So many of our sessions are split up among 4 different studios, and we come together. And that's one of the great things about radio, and is that people don't see all that. But it's also something that I like to point out because of how technology has enabled us to do so much more than we ever would have imagined. Mm-hmm. And how appreciative I am of the fact that we've been trusted with the resources to put these kind of studio connections together so we can get a lot of stuff done. I had somebody say to me the other day, you guys sound like, I think sometimes I'm listening to something like at NPR. I mean, where do you come up with all of these resources to make all this happen? And I thought, well, number one, it's a lot cheaper to do it than when NPR was getting started. And secondly, it's because of donors just like you, who make, and which all of us happen to be, by the way, in case people didn't know this, everyone associated with the Public Square is also a donor. Now, it's not a job requirement. They were all donors before they got associated with the Public Square. Because we're interested in telling these stories about America and telling them to the world and telling them to the next generation. So, yes, I was on a big adventure.
Yeah. And not to get real technical, but back in the 90s, there was something called Switch 56, which made it sound like you were in the same place at the same time, you know? Then it became ISDN, then it became broadband, and here we are today. Everybody has broadband now, so.
This history of radio brought to you by Wayne Shepherd Communications. You can find Wayne in Chicago, Illinois.
I just remember how difficult it was to call the phone company up and convince them they did have the technology I was talking about.
On the way to Washington, I was flying next to a gentleman from Naperville.
Oh, yeah.
You've ever been there?
I'm in Naperville right now as we speak.
Did he know Wayne?
No,
Did you say, hey, do you know Wayne?
He didn't know Wayne, but
everybody knows Wayne.
He was on his way to do a meeting in Washington, D.C., and he was talking about how tough it is to live in Illinois right now.
I've heard.
Don't get me started.
Yeah, how many people are leaving? And I have to tell you, we'll get back to this in the future of this program, but I think maybe it's a good setup because that's really where the adventure began and listening to this conversation. Now, my wife was sitting next to me and she was having the conversation. I've learned this. She's an excellent airplane conversationalist. Wayne's taught me to always pretend that you're sleeping. So I've got the window seat, head propped up, earbuds in, but of course, they're down low enough that I can hear everything that's going on, and I'm taking mental notes.
Talk to the wife because I'm not listening. Right.
Yeah, exactly. He taught me all this. He said how to wear the hat, how to get in the corner, how nobody knows who you are. It's wonderful. But how to survive in the world of flying. But this gentleman said something that I still haven't recovered from. He said, I told all my kids that I would pay for their college education on one condition, and that's that when they graduate, they move out of Illinois.
Wow.
And he said the last one is getting her master's degree in just a few months, and wherever she lands as a job, my wife and I are leaving and going to live with them. And this guy has been in the financial business, very successful. His family continues for an entire lifetime. And he said, I just can't take the politics anymore of Chicagoland.
Yep.
And I thought to myself,
tragic.
This is what's happening around the country. So this was the setup of us going into D.C., Wayne, talking about what's happening in the States.
Yeah. Why did you go to D.C.?
Went to D.C. because our dear friend, and there's no way to put, there's not enough adjectives or adverbs in the world to describe the depth of the love around this table for Dr. W.B. Allen and his wife, Carol, one of our trustees, and from which we're very, very thankful he would agree to serve with us on the board of the American Policy Roundtable. The preeminent political philosopher in America today. He was receiving an award from the Bradley Foundation. It's called the Bradley Prize. Dr. Allen and 2 other gentlemen were awarded. This is a very esteemed honor.
Yeah, it's a prestigious honor, isn't it?
Yeah, it's very prestigious. Comes with a significant cash award. It's a big deal. And he was being honored as a Bradley Prize winner this year. And for many minutes. And in fact, I ran into one of their board members as soon as we checked into the hotel. He said we should have done this a long time ago for Dr. Allen, but they have the opportunity to do it this year. So he was receiving this award, and we were invited to the event and to the gala, and it was quite an experience for me. It's not the kind of thing you catch me in very often, but I went and delighted to do so.
Well, today we're going to hear his acceptance speech in a few moments here on the Public Square. That's going to be a real treat.
It's a powerful speech, and I was there, and I had to listen to it. I talked with him just this morning. I spoke with him and said, I've listened to it 3 times now. It's only 15 minutes long. I said, but what surprises me is that you delivered it in your normal cadence, your normal rhythm. When I was listening to it in the room, I thought it was on fast forward. I said, everything was moving so quickly that night. It was such a powerful event and such a powerful evening that I felt like the game just got faster. And I was trying to get everything I could. I wasn't taking notes. I was just trying to hear it. I was focused on it really because I knew this was a big deal. But I said, then when I played it back in real time, I thought it was on slow motion. I thought, wow, it was so much bigger but the thing about the speech that is so wonderful is, first off, I got the key point because I had to tell him at breakfast the next day what it was that he said. And I passed a grade. And I got another passing grade from Dr.
You got
Allen.
an A. Okay.
I got the, well, not an A with him. It's a B. But I got the point, but I saw that he was actually speaking to the nation. And so I said, Doc, we've got to put this on the air, and we got his permission to do so because it really is a message. And I would say that it's also a message for people who consider themselves to be in the conservative community, in the conservative camp. I don't use that M word very often around here. There's certain banned words on the Public Square. The M word is one of them. And so we'll just say it's the conservative community of people. And I think he's speaking directly about the future of how people who have what they consider to be conservative thoughts and beliefs, how they should be looking at America going forward.
Well, let's make room to hear the entire speech here, the acceptance speech by Dr. Allen given just recently in Washington, D.C. We'll do that next on the Public Square, so don't miss this. Stay with us now.
Spreading the light of liberty across the land. Now back to the Public Square.
All right, now in the Public Square, let's go to Washington, D.C., and let's listen as Dr. Allen was given the Bradley Prize.
It humbles me to stand in an assembly of giants, looking eye to eye. I am reconciled to this circumstance only by the reflection that I stand on the shoulders of giants. Moreover, the thoughts that hold my attention at present are amplified by this reflection. For while our nation boasts a long succession of heroes, it remains the curious fact that it does not receive its dynamic thrust from its heroes. The dynamic thrust of the United States derives from those ordinary souls whose extraordinary patience and self-confidence constitutes the foundation of such longevity as we have enjoyed. This was manifested most dramatically in the great struggle to end the scourge of slavery. But it has been a recurrent theme from the origins of American civilization. In 1791, as a newly formed government under the Constitution was gaining its footing, and the people began sensibly to feel a rising prosperity, George Washington took note of the circumstance in a letter to Gouverneur Morris. He described the impressions he formed during an appraising progress through the southern states. He wrote, "I experienced great satisfaction in seeing the good effects of the general government in that part of the Union. The people at large have felt the security which it gives and the equal justice which it administers. Industry has there taken place of idleness, and economy of dissipation. 2 or 3 years of good crops and ready markets for the produce of their lands has put everyone in good humor. And in some instances, they even impute to the government what is due only to the goodness of providence. We find here no boasting, I did it, but a readiness to recognize the people's labors, a you did it. How far from the 21st century reality where there is no good that is not fathered by boasting leaders? Today, a president is far more likely to look upon ordinary citizens as unemancipated wards of a benevolent guardian. Quick to declaim, I did it, they inevitably depreciate the contributions of the citizens themselves. Political leaders today fail to see, let alone praise, the decency, generosity, and compassion so pervasive among the citizens of this country. In the face of politicians' dismissive characterizations of ordinary Americans as unworthy, complacent, lazy, bigoted, etc., ordinary Americans themselves still do not lose sight of that human dignity that originally gave rise to the spirit of self-government. President Reagan sought to introduce the country to that reality when he initiated the celebration of ordinary heroes in the manner he did with Lenny Skutnik. He called him a hero and did so to highlight the virtue of ordinary citizens. Since Reagan, ordinary citizens have been a staple of State of the Union addresses, but almost exclusively as representatives of suffering rather than as examples of worthy contribution. The heart and soul of American national character is twofold. It proceeds from the ordinary American's heroic insistence upon the freedom of conscience and acceptance of personal responsibility. And by freedom of conscience, I do not mean the license to do whatever one wishes, but rather the obligation owed to God, respecting which we must be free of secular restraint. It distorts the character of our nation to magnify the reality of suffering or victimhood in human life at the expense of praising the conscientious acceptance of the duties of civic life. I focus on this in particular because Colleen Sheehan and Stephen A. Cambone and I have explored for a little more than a decade the question, is there an American national character? We have begun to construct a response, and I wish still to see such a consummation of these labels as will recover an appreciation of the ordinary American as the real exceptionalism in the United States. The appreciation that I am suggesting is not intuitive, at least if we consult the familiar behavior of Americans who have traveled abroad in significant numbers ever since the 19th century. For far from the image of the ugly American, I have often observed a palpable sense of deference against the backdrop of ancient civilizations. Now, that may result from a propensity to look upon the people of the United States not as a people at all, but rather as a collection of peoples, understood only in terms of ancestral lineage. The consequence of that posture is that we derive meaning not from our received inheritance, but rather from mythical beginnings. However, I also find upon meeting Americans abroad a deeply communal, mutual recognition that does not result, I'm sure, from the particular accidents of our race, skin tones, etc., which so many want to look at as a signal of our national character. No, It reflects a clear thought that there is a common belonging amongst us, so pervasive that the particular accidents of our ancestral lineage recede to insignificance. We do not derive this meaning from the mythical beginnings of ancestors. We derive it from a uniquely shared appreciation, which the rest of the world often struggles to understand. That our ordinary American commitments to freedom of conscience and self-responsibility are the real exceptionalism. There is perhaps good reason for these confusions, however. For ever since the beginning of the 20th century, many experts cultivated a vision of pluralism rather than unity, falsely deriving it from James Madison's theory of a multiplicity of interest as somehow essential to the healthy functioning of an extended republic. Beyond the misdirections of political science and sociology, there is perhaps a still more powerful explanation for our failure to recognize an American national character. That explanation centers on the acquired habit of distinguishing citizens and residents by particular identities. An illustration of this tendency surfaced in the studies I mentioned when one contributor began with a focus on the peoples of the United States rather than we, the people, with the disaggregate rather than the aggregate. And that's highly revealing. Effectively, many people today generally disguise the American people as a collection of peoples, even proceeding so far as to parse the people's collective role into the Cheshire grin, diminishing to the point of vanishing. And we do that with the term people of color. Have you ever met a person without a color? Can this term convey any substantial meaning apart from a refusal to believe there is a common belonging so pervasive among a people that their particular accidents recede to insignificance? Such habits substantially erode our capacity to recognize and identify an American national character. But those habits can be overcome when we observe the tendency of those who wish to save democracy by nullifying the people's choice. We identify the remedy required, namely, reinforce the authority of the ordinary souls who express the only legitimate public will. That is the lesson we derive from revisiting the American founding. They are mistaken who imagine that we have engaged only in fostering opaque repetitions of slogans from the revolution. Rehearsing revolutionary resolves does not foster mastery of the terms of discourse. We revert to the founding to find fresh insights into the original questions. We have fresh questions, sure, but we believe that fresh insights will emerge with greater clarity if we pose those questions in the context of the original insights. That contrasts meaningfully with approaches that counsel starting anew, based on conceptual hypotheses of a brave new future. The former approach is capsulized in the argument for a revitalized civic national narrative for the United States. That appeal responds to the aimless musings about other possible nationalisms, conservative, Christian, liberal, cultural, ethnic, you name it. How might we summarize these inquiries? We highlight a fresh inquiry into the dynamic thrust of American civilization, beginning with a focus on the meaning of the term itself. It is, after all, not a place name. The prevailing use today is, in fact, an identifiable national character, a specific way of life. We elicit national character from a national consideration of the grounds upon which nationality was initially founded, which is to say, the grounds of humanity. After all, the Declaration of Independence opens with the phrase, when in the course of human events, not when in the course of events. The distinction is fundamental. The American claim remains rooted in the willingness to govern moral reflection with reference to the definition of the human. It does not admit of open-ended transfigurations of the human. This recognition of the definitional foundation of American nationality opens the pathway to identification of specific characteristics and functions, and none is more important than insistence upon the freedom of conscience. The moral derivative is the spawn of liberty and the source of the dynamic thrust of American civilization. Upon it, we built a stronghold within which every ordinary American finds shelter from imposition and authoritarian insult. Moreover, the freedom of conscience by definition includes every faith, at the same time that any nation, including the United States, must make expedient decisions regarding admission to citizenship in the United States. Eligibility for it is in principle open to any human. And that should not surprise us when we reflect that God owes us nothing, yet gives us everything. What each citizen embraces upon admission into citizenship is the responsibility of self-government. George Washington declared in 1783 that we have a national character to establish. What he invoked, however, was not a legislative agenda, but an agenda of personal responsibility. The national character centered on the separate, while not separable, exertions of each citizen to attain that degree of self-control which is called self-government. How, you may wonder, can a thing be separate but not separable? The answer is that individual exertions can only attain fruition within the context of the collective guarantee of opportunity for each to perform on his or her own, free from coercion and fraud as far as possible. That is, the individual discovers him or herself as an individual only within the crowd. There is no I without you. Accordingly, separate performances are effectual only when inseparably united in a community of self-governing souls. The philosopher Montesquieu expressed the substance of both virtue and liberty when he observed that every person thought to have a free soul ought to be self-governing. What that means is that the principle of self-government is at once an ethical principle and a political necessity. That is the reason it characterizes the role of the ordinary citizen, and that is the reason we derive from it the fuel that drives our society. Any policy, practice, or judicial rule contrary to that necessity is inconsistent with the American national character.
Our own Dr. William B. Allen, his acceptance speech in Washington, D.C., Dave Zanotti was there, and he'll talk about it with us coming up on the Public Square.
We will be right back for more on the Public Square.
So glad you tuned in today to hear that wonderful acceptance speech by Dr. Allen. And the team is here to talk about it. The team is Dave Zanotti, Rob Walgate, Jeff Sanders, Melanie L.C., and Alan C. Duncan. Rob?
Well, anytime he talks, he has my attention. That's for sure. And I was interested in the speech, and of course, what were we, 30 seconds in, 45 seconds in, and I was already distracted because he used the word patience. And I thought of all words to use to describe what's happening today, we're not very patient as a society. And he's going back in history to talk to us about the patience that was necessary then, but also patience thinking of how it's necessary now. But it's something we don't want to look for. And I was like, leave it to him a minute into a 15-minute speech to have me like, oh, great, I got to stop it and think for 1 second. So, but that's what he does. That's who he is.
What impressed me about listening to his speech is the fact that I had to go back and listen to it more than once because he would say things that I didn't. It's like, oh, I missed that. Wait a minute. What was it that he just said? So I'd have to rewind it a little bit.
This is what we hear from our listeners most often, that they love to listen to Dr. Allen twice.
But what struck me was the focus of his remarks was on what he referred to as the spirit of self-government. And throughout his speech, focused on that, he finished by saying self-government is an ethical principle and a political necessity. It is the fuel that drives our society. But through his speech, he will distinguish between some of the nuances, like in the Declaration where it says, in the course of human events, he says it's not talking about the course of events, and he describes the importance of the term humanity. So you have to listen for those
Wasn't that cool?
It was super cool. Those are the pieces that I had to go back and listen and rewind to say, what was that he just said? But it was so impressive.
It's not your average acceptance speech. Let's just say that.
No.
But it's a very dense 15 minutes. I thought I could just kind of throw it on, have it on in the background, do some things. No.
Yeah.
I was stopping it, pausing it, rewinding it, listening again to little certain portions of it. So yeah, just the density of it. He speaks very similarly to the way he writes.
Yeah.
There's a lot in a small amount of time, which is, I don't know, it's a pretty amazing way to communicate.
The thing that grabs my attention is that, when I think that I've read so much about the Founding Fathers, he pulls out of nowhere this obscure letter from George Washington. Everybody knows who George Washington is, right? To Gouverneur Morris, who, if I'm not badly mistaken, was one of the Founding Fathers, one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, but most people don't even know how to pronounce the guy's name, and much less know anything about him. And he pulls this letter out. It's just a letter from one guy to another, and yet he extrapolates from this a whole political theory of what's going on at that time as opposed to what's going on today. And he shows the marked contrast. So that was amazing to me.
What Dr. Allen has done in his career for George Washington is very comparable to what David McCullough did for John Adams.
True.
McCullough's work brought Adams back into the forefront for reconsideration and for deeper understanding. Dr. Allen began this work many, many years ago, a lifetime ago, on bringing the mind, the intellect, the character, the persona of George Washington back into a current understanding, not fanciful or filled with mythology, but based upon original source documents. And this is critical.
Well, and Dave, would you say that he's done that more in the academic space, whereas McCullough did it more in the pop culture space?
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing, Alan. Right.
Very much so. Very much so, Alan. And he's done it based upon original source documents, which is critical, which is very much akin to when we talked to David McCullough multiple times and then with Mike Hill, how much time these historians have spent in the Library of Congress at Mount Vernon. I know when we toured with Dr. Allen at Mount Vernon, and then we spent time there doing research together and talking together. It's phenomenal. First off, it's like he's home when Dr. Allen's at Mount Vernon, and everyone is happy to see him. He's been a scholar in association with that organization for such a long time, and he's done such wonderful work there. But his passion to bring back Washington as the leading intellect of the era, when people thought, oh, this was the guy that had fanciful myths made up about him, chopping down cherry trees and silver dollars across the Potomac, the leading wooden teeth, and maybe just because he was the tallest guy in the room, he had the most attention, so he became the first president because it was a popularity contest. Dr. Allen goes back as far as 1783 in the circular letter to the states and shows how Washington was systematically building literally the pillars of what the new government of America had to look like and why. And it's the most compelling argument of the era. It went across all the newspapers. Washington was the one that they had to have at the convention. There wasn't going to be a convention if Washington wasn't there, and it wasn't because he was popular. It's because they knew he knew how to do this right.
You know, all of this is there. It's in the record, but it takes people like Dr. Allen to ferret it out. I mean,
to selflessly dedicate their life to this.
That's what I picture him at the Library of Congress. I'm fascinated by that institution, but I'm fascinated by the picture of him just patiently doing his research and coming up with these gems that he comes up with.
Well, Wayne, you mentioned Library of Congress. A lot of the primary source documentation research that Dr. Allen used is actually just above our heads right now. You know, all of the writings that George Washington has ever done in his whole life are in a 39-volume set above our heads right now in the American Mission Center.
Wow.
So that's kind of cool just to think about.
I don't know if the two men ever met, but wouldn't it have been amazing to be a fly on the wall between David McCullough and Dr. Allen? To hear the kind of conversation the two of them would have.
Afforded.
That would have been a television miniseries.
Oh, my God. Oh, now that just makes me sad. That just makes me weep that never happened.
Well, they'll meet in heaven someday.
True.
Right?
We could do what they just did. We could do C.S. Lewis and Sigmund Freud. Maybe we'll do one. We'll make up a fictional meeting. Of
there you go.
I know one thing. The room would be so permeated with profound and sincere respect because of the scholarship, and I mean the reading. We had lunch with Dr. Allen while we were in D.C., and I had asked him a question about a recent Supreme Court decision, and he gave me an answer that just completely turned my thinking upside down. And Debbie was looking at me, and I was looking at her, and there he goes again. And I said to him over lunch, I said, "Doc, how do you know this stuff? I mean, you know this government so well that I ask you stuff, and I've lawyers, judges, politicians, nobody do I know that knows this government the way you do." And he says, "I dwell on it. I dwell on it." He spent his life thinking on these things.
It's interesting you say the Supreme Court. You asked him about a decision, because when I heard him talking about the primary source documents and doing research, the Supreme Court's the first thing I thought of, because I thought so much of what they do, they yield to precedent, and they don't go back to the original. And I thought, wow, I hope some of the justices take a listen to this speech and have an understanding about what it means to go to get primary source documents.
Well, Dave, you mentioned him dwelling on it and thinking about it. We're talking about David McCullough as well. That's what David McCullough said. People ask him how long it took you to write your books. He says, nobody ever asked me how long I thought about them. So both of them are saying the same thing. And is that something we're losing in our culture today? We are constantly flooded with information. We think we're the most educated generation ever because it's at our fingertips. But do we ever stop and think about things?
Yeah. Let's take a break. This is The Public Square. We've got a lot to talk about. We'll continue in a moment. We're online always at thepublicsquare.com and with that smartphone app as well.
Spreading the light of liberty across the land. Now back to the public square.
Let's continue down this road we've been on here today on the Public Square, talking about the Bradley Prize awarded so honorably to Dr. William B. Allen. We heard his acceptance speech here earlier in the program. If you joined us late, you got to go back in the archive and online and listen to this program from the beginning to hear that acceptance speech. But let's continue talking about it as a team.
Let's get back to the speech that Dr. Allen gave, but I also want to mention that there were 3 recipients of the Bradley Prize this year. Samuel Gregg, who's an economist, an outstanding presentation, as well as Jay Bhattacharya. And you remember Jay Bhattacharya because we covered his work here during the COVID crisis, because Dr. Bhattacharya is both a physician at Stanford University and a PhD economist at Stanford University. And he is one of the original founders of the Great Barrington Declaration, which now has over 1 million signatories of medical professionals and business people and citizens from around the world in regards to how we should deal ethically and responsibly with health crises like pandemics. And he received the Bradley Prize for that work.
Wow. Did you get smarter just being in the room with these guys?
Well, I have to stay a lot longer than some to pick it up. But I do feel like I was a rope on the Goodyear blimp with this crowd. I mean, I was hanging on for all that I was worth.
That's what I was thinking. Set the crowd for us. What venue was it at? Can you give us a little info about that?
There's a beautiful building in Washington, D.C. that very few people know about. It's a building that memorializes buildings.
Yeah.
But what it really is it's an old Civil War building that's been reconverted now, and it's an event center. Yeah. And so it was a very elegant setting interior, but it was a big event center, big old building.
Looked like there were some huge pillars from the video.
Yeah, it's a giant room. I've been there. It's a massive room, and very ornate.
Very extraordinary, and it's got a wonderful history. It was a pensioners' building where the Civil War soldiers would come in and get their pensions, and it's a wonderful history. Not just down from the Smithsonian Museum of Art, which we'll talk about probably in another broadcast very soon. But the event was elegant. It wasn't black tie, fortunately, because it took me enough to...
I'm so disappointed. I wanted to see you in black tie.
Yeah, no stripe. No, I do not do bow ties. It's on the anti-bucket list.
No swallowtail coat.